At first glance, it was the kind of photograph you'd pass over without a second thought. A neatly dressed couple seated side by side in a studio, their child centered between them. Neutral backdrop, soft lighting, the kind of image meant to last, meant to reassure future generations that everything at least once was fine. The parents were smiling, not broadly, not warmly, but enough to meet the expectations of the camera. Their posture was stiff, formal, as was common for the era. The child looked straight ahead, eyes wide, expression unreadable. Nothing about the photograph seemed unusual. Nothing begged for attention. That was why it stayed untouched for so long. When experts finally examined the image during a routine restoration, they focused on the obvious first: creases in clothing, dust scars, fading edges. Then someone noticed the hands. Both parents' hands were resting low, partially obscured by shadow, positioned too carefully to be casual. Fingers curled, knuckles pale. The symmetry was unsettling once seen, impossible to ignore. Enhancement brought clarity, but not comfort. Whatever they were holding had been deliberately hidden from the lens, tucked just out of sight, as if the parents believed the camera could see more than it should. As if they feared the photograph might reveal the truth if they weren't careful. The smiles suddenly felt rehearsed. The stillness felt strained. And the longer the image was studied, the clearer it became that this was not a portrait meant to celebrate a family, but to preserve a moment just before something went terribly, deliberately wrong. For decades, the photograph existed in a state of quiet anonymity, filed away among thousands of similar studio portraits taken during the same era. It was catalogued, labeled, and stored without ceremony, treated as a routine example of early family photography. Archivists saw nothing more than a conventional composition. Parents seated upright, child-centered, backdrop carefully arranged to project stability and respectability. It fit perfectly into the visual language of its time, when photographs were formal affairs and emotions were subdued in favor of dignity. Because it matched expectations so precisely, it never demanded closer attention. Visitors who encountered the image during exhibitions or research sessions often described it as calm or ordinary. Some even found it comforting, a reminder of a slower, simpler past. The soft lighting and careful framing gave it a sense of permanence, as if the moment had been frozen not just in time but in meaning. There was no dramatic gesture, no visible conflict, no obvious flaw. The photograph seemed to do exactly what it was meant to do, preserve a family as they wished to be remembered. Its ordinariness became its greatest disguise. Archivists are trained to notice anomalies, blurred faces, strange shadows, damaged negatives. But this image offered none of those red flags. It aged quietly, gathering only the kind of wear expected of paper and ink. Each decade that passed reinforced the assumption that there was nothing more to see. It was referenced occasionally in academic work about studio photography practices, cited as an example of compositional balance and period. Appropriate posture, then returned to storage. What made the photograph particularly unremarkable was how well it aligned with cultural norms of the time. Families often used studio portraits to project unity and control, even when reality was far messier. Stiff smiles and rigid poses were not signs of discomfort, they were signs of propriety. The lack of visible affection was not unusual. To modern eyes, the image might appear emotionally distant, but to historians it was simply accurate. Because the photograph never stood out, it was never questioned. No one asked what happened before or after the shutter clicked. No one wondered why the child's expression resisted easy interpretation. The image fulfilled its role so completely that it became invisible, blending into the vast visual archive of the past. It was trusted, accepted, and forgotten in plain sight, waiting patiently in the dark for someone to finally look at it not as a symbol of normalcy, but as a moment suspended for a reason, a moment that only pretended to be harmless, a moment that survived untouched because it never once gave anyone a reason to be afraid. The photograph might have remained undisturbed indefinitely if not for a routine decision to modernize the archive. As part of a broader preservation effort, a small team of restoration specialists selected several aging prints for high-resolution scanning, chosen not for their importance but for their condition. This image was included simply because its paper stock was beginning to yellow and its edges showed signs of brittleness. There was no expectation of discovery, only the intent to preserve what already seemed fully understood. Once digitized, the photograph was enlarged far beyond what the naked eye could comfortably absorb. Details that had once blended into the overall composition separated into distinct elements. Fabric textures became sharper, facial lines more pronounced. The restoration process required slow, methodical inspection of every section of the image to correct minor distortions and remove surface noise. It was during this careful, almost mechanical review that something began to feel subtly wrong. The first reaction was not fear but confusion. One of the specialists paused over the lower portion of the frame, drawn by an imbalance that was difficult to articulate. The parents' hands, resting near their laps, appeared unusually rigid. Fingers were curled too tightly, tendons faintly visible even through the limitations of the original print. In most studio portraits of the era, hands were relaxed or gently posed to suggest ease. Here, they seemed restrained, as though resisting movement rather than expressing calm. At first, this tension was attributed to coincidence or poor posing direction. Yet the longer the image was examined, the harder it became to dismiss. Both parents displayed the same posture, mirrored with uncomfortable precision. Their hands were angled inward, partially obscured by shadow, positioned just low enough to escape immediate scrutiny. It was the symmetry that unsettled the observers, the sense that the pose had been carefully coordinated for a reason that went beyond aesthetics. When contrast levels were adjusted to compensate for fading, the unease deepened. The shadows around the hands were denser than expected, swallowing details that should have been visible given the studio lighting. The rest of the image responded predictably to enhancement, but this area resisted clarity, as if something within it had been intentionally concealed. The smiles and faces above suddenly felt disconnected from what was happening below, creating a silent contradiction within the frame. What had once seemed like an unremarkable photograph now demanded attention. The experts found themselves returning to the image repeatedly, not because they had identified a definitive anomaly, but because they could not explain the tension their own eyes refused to ignore. The discovery was not a single shocking revelation, but a slow realization that the photograph had been quietly withholding information all along, and that its apparent innocence might have been the most deliberate element of all. As the investigation continued, the restoration team moved beyond basic correction and into forensic-level enhancement, applying advanced techniques designed to recover obscure details rather than improve aesthetics. Multiple scans were layered, light frequencies isolated, and depth reconstructed from subtle variations in grain. The goal was no longer preservation alone but understanding. Whatever lay hidden in the shadows around the parents' hands had become the focal point of the image, demanding to be resolved. With each adjustment, the surrounding elements sharpened, but the hands revealed themselves only in fragments. The outline of fingers grew clearer, the pressure of the grip more defined. It became evident that the tension was not incidental. Both parents were holding something solid, something that resisted the natural curve of the palm. The object was narrow and elongated, concealed along the line of their thighs, positioned so the camera's perspective would miss it entirely unless the image was pushed beyond its original limits. What unsettled the team most was the precision. The objects in each parent's hand appeared identical in size and placement, aligned with an intentional symmetry that suggested planning rather than instinct. This was not a nervous habit or an unconscious pose. It was coordinated, practiced, and executed with care. The photograph was beginning to look less like a spontaneous portrait and more like a carefully staged scene. As shadow density was reduced, faint highlights emerged along the hidden forms. The surface reflected light differently from skin or fabric, indicating a material that did not belong in a family portrait. It was smooth in some areas, rigid in others, with edges that seemed too straight to be accidental. The experts hesitated to define it, aware that premature conclusions could distort interpretation, yet none of the possibilities felt benign. What made the discovery truly disturbing was the emotional contradiction it introduced. Above the concealed objects, the parents' expressions remained composed, even compliant, as if participating in a familiar ritual. Below, their hands told a different story, one of restraint and intent. The child between them now appeared less like the subject of the photograph and more like its context, framed by adults whose focus was not on the camera, but on maintaining control over what they were hiding. Further magnification revealed subtle compression in the skin around the fingers, suggesting the objects were being held firmly for a sustained period rather than briefly posed. This implied anticipation, perhaps even necessity. The photograph captured not a single instant, but a prolonged state of readiness. It preserved the moment not because it was ordinary, but because it needed to be remembered exactly as it was. By the time the enhancement process concluded, there was no longer any doubt that the parents had deliberately concealed something from the camera. The photograph had crossed a boundary, transforming from historical artifact into evidence. Whatever those objects were, they had been hidden with intention, equal care, and shared purpose, and the image now stood as silent proof that the truth had been present all along, waiting beneath the surface for the technology and the courage to bring it into the light. Once the concealed objects were confirmed, attention shifted away from the photograph itself and toward the lives it represented. Archivists began the slow process of cross-referencing names, dates, and locations associated with the studio where the image was taken. Old registry books, census records, and local newspapers were examined, initially with the expectation of filling in harmless biographical gaps. Instead, the search produced an absence so complete it felt intentional. The parents appeared briefly in municipal documents, their names surfacing once or twice before vanishing from official records, as if their lives had folded inward after a specific point in time. It was the child, however, who left the deepest void. Birth records confirmed the child's existence, aligning perfectly with the estimated age suggested by the photograph. Yet beyond that single confirmation, there was nothing. No school enrollment, no medical logs, no later census appearance. In a period when documentation was less thorough than today but still persistent, such a disappearance stood out. Children did not simply evaporate from the record without cause, especially when both parents were present and accounted for, at least temporarily. Local newspapers from the surrounding years were scanned next, not for headlines, but for small notices and overlooked columns. Buried among advertisements and social updates was a brief mention of a missing child, written in careful, restrained language. The description was minimal, offering no illustration and no emotional appeal, as though the writer feared attracting attention. The notice appeared only once. There were no follow-ups, no reports of search efforts, no resolution. After that single mention, silence resumed. The timing of the notice aligned disturbingly well with the estimated date of the photograph. The gap between the studio session and the disappearance was measured not in years, but in days. This compressed timeline suggested that the photograph may have been taken not as a keepsake, but as a final act, a deliberate marker placed just before an irreversible event. The image stopped being a record of family life and began to resemble a boundary between what existed briefly and what was erased. Further investigation revealed that the photography studio itself had kept unusually detailed logs. One entry noted the session as completed under special instruction, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in the records. There was no explanation attached, no elaboration, only a subtle indication that the photographer had been asked to comply with conditions outside the norm. The meaning of those conditions was never clarified, but their presence added another layer of intent to the moment captured on film. As researchers assembled these fragments, a pattern emerged that felt less like coincidence and more like design. The child had not drifted out of history by accident. The disappearance followed too closely, the documentation ended too cleanly, and the photograph sat at the exact center of it all. What had once been assumed lost now seemed deliberately removed, as if the photograph was never meant to preserve a life that continued, but to stand as the only surviving proof that the child had ever existed at all. The final interpretation emerged slowly, resisted at first by those involved because of what it implied about intention. Photographs are commonly understood as records, passive witnesses to moments already unfolding. This image refused that role. When viewed alongside the recovered evidence, it suggested forethought rather than nostalgia, purpose rather than memory. The careful staging, the mirrored concealment, the precise timing all pointed toward a moment constructed to exist beyond itself. Experts began to reconsider why the photograph had been taken at all. The family did not appear prosperous enough to indulge in unnecessary studio sessions, nor was there any indication of a milestone that would normally justify the expense. The absence of subsequent photographs reinforced this unease. This was not part of a tradition or a series. It stood alone, isolated in both form and function. That isolation began to feel deliberate, as though the image was never meant to be followed by another. The objects hidden in the parents' hands took on new significance in this context. They were no longer simply concealed items but symbols of resolve. Their presence suggested that the parents entered the studio already committed to an outcome that required preparation and coordination. The photograph did not interrupt that plan, it accommodated it. The camera became complicit, capturing the final moment of restraint before action replaced stillness. What unsettled researchers most was the child's position within the frame. Centered, balanced, and visually emphasized, the child appeared to be the subject, yet all evidence suggested otherwise. The true focus lay beneath the surface, in what was being controlled rather than what was being shown. The child's calm expression could now be read not as innocence, but as unawareness, a quiet presence framed by decisions already made on their behalf. The idea that the photograph functioned as a warning rather than a keepsake gained traction among those who studied it longest. Not a warning to authorities or contemporaries, but to the future. A preserved moment designed to outlive its creators, holding within it the clues necessary for understanding what could not be spoken or documented openly. The parents may have believed that truth, once fixed in an image, would eventually find eyes capable of seeing it. In this interpretation, the photograph was not evidence discovered by chance, but evidence planted intentionally. A silent confession that relied on time and technology rather than words. The parents' smiles were not meant to deceive, but to comply with the expectations of the era, ensuring the image would be accepted, archived, and preserved. Only then could it survive long enough to be examined beyond its surface. Seen this way, the photograph becomes an act of control extending beyond the moment it captured. It ensured that when the child vanished and records went quiet, something would remain that could not be erased. Not an explanation, not an apology, but a frozen instant carrying the weight of what was about to happen, waiting patiently for the future to uncover what the present was never meant to confront.